Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to the E-invoicing technical workshop dubbed as FATOORA. This is the first technical workshop that we're having after we released the implementation resolution in May 28th. The aim of this workshop is to discuss the technical requirement that we have released recently. Today's workshop is going to be in English, but if you're interested in having this workshop in Arabic, we're going to hold another workshop on Thursday. فالأخوان المهتمين باللغة العربية حيكون عندنا ورشة عمل إن شاء الله يوم الخميس ممكن تحضروها إن شاء الله. Okay, moving forward. So in today's workshop, we're going to discuss a couple of things. So first, we're going to introduce the e-invoicing in the kingdom as a whole, and then we're going to go over the e-invoicing model and the different aspects of e-invoicing, and then we're going to have a general requirement about the technical requirement, general discussion about the technical requirement implemented in the technical resolution. And then we're going to showcase some of the technical documents that's being attached to the technical resolution. And finally, we're going to hear from you and see if you have any questions. So if you have any question, please type away in the chat in the Q&A panel. So basically, invoicing, the aim of e-invoicing is to convert the manual generation of e-invoices into a digital form. So we're talking about generating the invoices, storing the invoicing, amending the invoicing, and the whole structure of the invoice. Everything has to be converted into digital. And when we say digital, this by default eliminates any handwritten e-invoice or any scanned paper invoices. So if you have any invoice and you've scanned it through a scanner, this does not mean it's an e-invoice. Also, this applies to PDF or Word formatted invoices. So if you're typing the invoice in Word or PDF, this will also not be considered. So basically, invoice is anything that has to be generated from a system and in a structured manner. This will be only considered as an e-invoice. Now, when we talk about the objective of e-invoicing in the kingdom, there are several objectives to this. So first of all, it will help us, inshallah, in reducing the shadow economy of Saudi economy, inshallah. It will also increase the compliance rate of our taxpayers and obligations. It will also reduce the commercial concealment when it comes to tracking data retention. Also, this has been implemented in a global scale, so e-invoicing is not something new. The kingdom is not the first to implement such a practice. We're trying to adopt the international practices when it comes to the invoicing. And finally, this will also enable fair competition between our taxpayers and provide some consumer protection to our consumers. So there are two main phases when it comes to invoices, e-invoicing program. The first phase, which will be in effect in 4th of December in 2021. This phase, we call it the generation phase. It's a very basic phase. Basically, what we're saying here is that we want all the invoices in the kingdom to be converted into digital format, and that's it. There is no extra requirement in that. We'll go deeper, inshallah, in the next few slides to see what are the requirements in the generation phase. Now, when we say that this is not generation, it's not only just generation. We're talking about the whole life cycle of the invoice. So we're talking about generation, storage, and sharing the invoice if needed to be. Plus, there is one extra requirement, which is embedding the QR code into the invoice. So the end user or consumer can scan the QR code and get some information about the invoice in a digital format. And the next phase, which is the big phase, which is we call the integration phase, that will be starting from January 1st, 2023. In this phase, we're requiring the taxpayers to integrate with Zacchaeus systems. So any invoice generated by the taxpayer has to fly into our systems. So we understand that this requirement is not something easy to be done. That's why you can see the timeline is very stretched. We heard from you, we heard from everyone that having a tight timeline might impact the overall success of the project. That's why we have extended the timeline to have it in waves. So not everyone will be impacted in the beginning. Inshallah, soon you will be hearing from us, seeing how this implementation will be split into waves. So we'll be targeting some certain taxpayers in the first wave, and then second wave, and third wave, until everyone, inshallah, onboarded on this program. Now, the main difference here in integration phase, first of all, we're going to require the format of the invoice to be very specific. So we're talking about either an XML format or PDF A3 format. These two formats will be only acceptable format for e-invoice. Now, of course, this is when it comes to the system generated, but this does not stop the taxpayer from generating a paper-based invoice. So basically, you have to generate, store this invoice in XML or PDF A3. However, you can also still print this to your end users. And we are also requiring in the integration phase more fields to ensure the security of the invoice and from the whole life cycle of the invoice. And finally, as we said, that it's going to be integrated with our system. So any invoice generated in the kingdom has to be replicated in our systems. Moving forward to the e-invoicing model, we have two main models. We're talking about standard invoices. This is mainly targeting the B2C segment. The B2B segment, and we have the simplified invoices. We're talking about the B2C. So if we take a look at the generation phase, the B2B, it will be very simple in the generation phase. Basically, you'll just generate the invoice as you're doing right now. However, it has to be in electronic format. It cannot be in a manual format as we discussed before. And you just share it with the buyer, and that's it. There is no extra requirement that you need to do. However, when it comes to the simplified invoice, similarly, you will do the same thing that you're doing right now if you're not doing the manual generation, if you're doing it in an electronic way. However, you also have to embed a QR code capability into the invoice itself. This will allow the end user or the customer or consumer to scan this QR code, and they can get some brief information about the invoice itself. Now, this is the generation phase. Now, when we're talking about the integration phase, which is the most complicated one, for the standard invoices or the B2B, we're adopting the clearance model, meaning that any invoice that has to be generated by the system, it cannot be shared with the buyer without being cleared by Zacchaeus itself. So you have to send the invoice to Zacchaeus system. We have to clear it from our side, and then once you get the clearance and the stamp from Zacchaeus, then you can share it with the buyer. Now here, the buyer will have the option to check the stamp that has been stamped, the invoice that has been stamped from Zacchaeus system, and they can check the eligibility of this invoice. This is when it comes to B2B. And for B2C, we understand that the transaction of B2C, it's more time sensitive. So we're not going to put Zacchaeus in the middle of the transaction. No, the B2C machines can still generate the invoices immediately. However, they have to still send the invoice copy to Zacchaeus, because in the end, the QR code, once the consumer scans the QR code, they have to check into our system and make sure that the invoice has reached Zacchaeus and it is a valid invoice. So this is a quick overview about the two different phases in e-invoicing with the two different modules that we have. Now here we just a clearer diagram about the whole generation phase for standard invoices. It's basically the supplier can share the invoice currently what we have. And when we go into integration, Zacchaeus platform will be introduced in the middle. Here where we have the clearance module and have all invoices cleared by Zacchaeus system before it can be shared by the buyer. And in the end, the buyer can also verify the invoices by checking the clearance status with Zacchaeus platform. This will give more credibility and more security to the buyer himself. Now, when it comes to the generation phase for the B2C, as we said, it's business as usual. We'll be doing the same thing. However, we'll be embedding the QR code. This is the main requirement for generation for B2C. However, when we move into the integration, there will be an extra step, which is sending the invoice from the cashiers or from the end user systems into Zacchaeus platform. This will also give the ability for the consumers to scan the QR code and verify that this invoice is very valid by checking it against Zacchaeus platform. Now let's go deeper into the technical requirements that were released recently. So here we have defined the requirements into two separate phases. We have the generation phase and we have the integration phase. As you can notice, the generation phase requirements are very minimal. We're not trying to impose so many requirements in the generation phase because we understand that it's a very recent phase and we don't want to impact the operation of the businesses. So when it comes to the invoice generation for the generation phase, we're talking about any invoice generated by a system. It has to be generated by a technical system. It cannot be done manually. The invoice fields are going to be same that we have right now in VAT regulation with some minimum mandatory fields. And the format, there is no required format to be stored. However, when we talk about the integration phase, no. Here we're talking about a specific format with specific fields that have to be embedded. As we said, it's going to be converted into XML or PDF A3 with embedded XML in the file, plus some extra required fields that are going to ensure the security and authenticity of the invoice. So if we go into the security and integrity requirement, In the generation phase, the QR code itself is going to be optional. We're saying this because it's only optional for the standard invoice. However, when we talk about the simplified invoice, it's going to be mandatory. When we talk about the cryptographic stamp, it's going to be not required at the beginning. When we talk about the hash code, it's not going to be required. Also, the UUID and the tamper-resistant counter. When we talk about the prohibited functionalities, what we're trying to achieve here is just have something very basic. There is no allowed uncontrolled access. There is no tampering with the invoice or the logs, and there is multiple invoice sequences. However, when we go into the in the integration phase, no, the QR code is going to be mandatory. You have to be printing the QR code for the standard invoices, and then you also have to embed the cryptographic stamp within the invoice itself, within the XML, upon clearance from Gazette, of course, or from Zacchaeus. And for the hash, yes, you have to now generate the hash and embed it within the invoice. All the details of this you will find it, inshallah, in the documentation that we have released, plus the UUID, which ensures the sequence for all your invoices. It also has to be embedded within the invoice itself. And when we talk about the tamper-resistant counter, also the solution has to implement some sort of a tamper-proofing and resistant counter that increments for each invoice and not issued. This counter will be used to detect if there is any tampering happening on the machine. Other prohibited functionalities, time change and export of stamping keys. These functionalities has to be prohibited and they cannot be done on the system. Now, when we talk about the integration, connectivity in the beginning is not required. Your machine can be offline. This is fine because there is no integration, so you don't need connectivity. Similarly, the integration. However, when you go into the integration phase, no, you have to establish an end-to-end secure connectivity with Zacchaeus system, and you also have to send all the invoices in real time or near real time to Zacchaeus system. These are all the main high-level technical requirements when it comes to standard invoices or the B2B invoices. Now, moving forward to the QR code, as we said in the simplified invoice, which is required for the B2C, QR code will be required from generation and from integration as well. However, the functionality of the QR code will differ here. Since there is no integration in the generation phase, basically the QR code will only be scanned to show the seller's name, the VAT registration number of the seller, a timestamp of the invoice or the credit debit note, the e-invoice or the debit code amount with the VAT plus the VAT amount. So these are all basic information that can be extracted from the invoice itself. There is no need for integration. However, once we move into the integration phase, here we're adding some extra fields that has to be embedded within the QR code. Namely, we're talking about the hash of the XML itself, the cryptographic stamp, the public key that was used to generate the cryptographic stamp, plus Zacchaeus portal cryptographic stamp with the public key of the invoicing solution. So these 4 extra requirements will only be required in the integration phase. It will not be needed in the generation phase. Moving forward with the implementation resolution that we have published on 28th of May, we also published several documentation related to this. You can go and have a look at it. It's very detailed. The first one is the actual invoicing resolution. It contains the controls, the requirement, the technical specification, and everything related to the invoicing. Then you're going to have a look at the data dictionary itself, all the data fields, all the acceptable data format, and so on and so forth. And then you're going to see the XML implementation standards with all the details required for you to implement such an e-invoicing compliance solution. And finally, you will find documentation related to security and features implementation standards required. Now, all of these are published on our website. You can always visit it and have a look at it. Now we're going to open the floor for the Q&A. If you have any questions or anything, please type it. Let me check with the team. Okay, so the first question comes from the team is that, is e-invoicing applicable on permanent establishments, PEs, who are just registered with Gazette for income tax and VAT? Now, from my understanding is that all VAT if it has a fixed establishment in KSA, such as company, shall be resident for VAT purposes obliged for invoice. So basically, anyone who is enrolled in VAT has to be compliant with this. The second question we have is, what is the information must be included in the QR code? Okay, so if we go back to the slides here, we can see that these are the requirements that you'll be needing for the QR code. We have two separate requirements. Each requirement is required for a certain phase. So for the generation, it's a very basic information, as we said, and then in the integration, you will have a different set of requirements. Like, do we have any other questions? Just to reiterate, the same session will be held in Arabic after tomorrow إن شاء الله. الإخوان اللي عندهم حرص على الموضوع بس باللغة العربية إن شاء الله حيكون عندنا ورشة عمل بعد بكرة على نفس الموضوع بس باللغة العربية. Okay, we have received another question from the team as, what do you mean by the store of the invoice? Is it in a local point of sale or is it in the cloud? So basically, it has to be stored as per the NCA requirement in Saudi Arabia, which means it has to be within KSA, regardless whether it's in the cloud or the point of sale itself. It can be stored anywhere as long as it resides within Saudi Arabia. Do we have more questions? Okay, we have another question here saying, can you elaborate on the prohibition of multiple invoice sequences? In the current ERP setup, we have multiple system-generated invoices sequences depending on the document type. Is that not acceptable? Right. So if we go back and see the fields that we require, we have one field specifically, we call it the UUID. So this is some sort of a global counter for you on the system. We understand that you might have several systems that generate invoices. However, they all have to have this field, which ensure that no other invoice has a duplicate, let's say, sequence number. So with this field, if you go deeper into the technical documents, you'll find how to implement such field. Okay, we have another question here saying that regarding the QR code, is there any special format for the result text? The text you can get after you scan the code, is it plain text or JSON format or XML or something else? Okay, so if you look at the security specification that we have published, you will find all the details. Please have at it and see what it contains. Basically, it is encoded in TLV and base 64. So for more details, please refer to the security document. Another question we have, is invoice deletion allowed? No, it's not. As per the current regulation of VAT, it's not something that is allowed. What you can do is that if you want to reverse an invoice, you can always rely on debit or credit note. So with the debit and credit code note, you can reference the original invoice and saying that this invoice has been redacted, for example, and say that you're nulling the amount with that amount, but it has to reference the original invoice. Okay, we have another question saying that what do you mean by UUID and how it will be implemented with the e-invoicing? Okay, so if you go back and check the documentation that we have published, you will find plenty of details regarding how to do this implementation. So please visit that. If you still have questions, you can always refer to our contact and contact us, please. Okay, we have another question here saying that, can I create invoices in two formats? One for the thermal printer and the other one in an A4 format. I mean, once the customer scans the QR code. So basically, if both of them satisfy the requirement of embedding the XML within this format or that format, you can print it in however format that you want. However, there has to be only one original copy of the XML or PDF/A3 format. We have another question here saying that in phase one, does e-invoicing need to be an XML or PDF? No. In phase one, we're not specifying any format for the invoice. However, you're encouraged to start from now implementing this feature, because we understand that the deployment or rollout might take some time for some of the service provider. We are always encouraged to include as much of the requirement that you can. However, no, the invoice format is not required in the generation phase, and you can generate it as you wish, as long as it's in an electronic format. Okay, we have another question asking about the clearance process again. So let me try to explain it again in a better way. So this is the whole sequence of the clearance. Basically, the supplier is going to generate the invoice from their system, following the format that we have specified in the documentation. You need to send this in real time to Zacchaeus platform. Zacchaeus platform will do some validation and ensure that the invoice is following the correct format, and then it will stamp it for you and will send the stamp back to you. So you will receive the file in a cleared manner and digitally stamped by Zacchaeus system. After that, you will get the cleared and stamped invoice in real time. Then you can share it with the buyer. So with the new response that you get from Zacchaeus system, you can share it with your buyer. So buyer has the option, it's not mandatory, they have the option to verify the invoice if it is cleared with or not by Zacchaeus platform. This is an extra feature that can give some sort of assurance for the buyers. Do we have more questions? Type, we have one question related to the integration when it will be done so they can start testing. We have yet to announce the dates for that. However, please stay tuned. Once we are ready to share the integration details, you will be receiving it firsthand. Please remember that the success of this project is depending heavily on you. Not all taxpayers are tech savvy that they understand all these technical requirements. So we really rely on our partner in the private sector to control this and provide them with the best solution that they can that fulfill our requirement. But we have another question here is saying, will e-invoicing solutions be certified? So right now we haven't announced any process or anything regarding that. However, if anything comes up or we have decided anything, you'll be the first to know. But if you haven't registered on our website, please go ahead and register. We really value the information and details that you give us. It will help us for the reach, and it will help us doing some market study regarding the impact of e-invoicing on the kingdom as a whole. So please go ahead to our website and register there. So one question is asking, in phase one, which is generation, can PDF with embedded electronic invoices be generated after generating the structured electronic invoice? Yes, we have no format specification for phase one, so you can generate it in whatever format that you want, as long as it's electronic and has all the fields that we have required. Okay, we have another question here saying that how can you share invoices with the customer? So this is up to you. Once you get the digitally signed invoice, you can share it with them however format that you want, as long as it fulfills all the requirements that we have, meaning that all the fields are there, the digital stamp is there, everything is there. Then you can share it with the buyer. You can share it in PDF/A3 with embedded XML. You can do whatever you want with it. Some buyers are ready for end-to-end integration, for example, so the supplier can share the actual XML into the buyer's system and they can read it natively. This is also an option that can be done. One of the questions is a critical question is what will be the process next steps if invoice is not cleared by Zatka in integration phase. So here it is very important to know what is the reason of not clearing with Zatka. If there is a failure in the format or something, then our system will tell you clearly what error message that you're getting and you need to resolve it. For example, if there is some sort of validation of the XML or some fields that were missing from the XML, you will receive a clear response from our system telling you what exactly to fix. Once it's fixed, you can push it again to Zatka platform to be cleared. One question saying phase 2 is available now for integration. No, phase 2 is not ready. As we said, phase 2 will start in January 2023. However, we're trying to bring the system up and running for testing and piloting before that, inshallah. You'll be receiving notification once, inshallah, everything is ready from our end. Another question we have is there any test environment that will be provided and code samples for different programming languages, please? So yes, we're working on creating some sort of a sandbox that you can test the integration and the format of your invoices. However, this is not ready yet. However, we are committed, inshallah, to help as much as we can to ease the transition for our service providers and taxpayers. If you have more questions, please. So we have received a question, will the taxpayers be able to connect and integrate directly with Zatka, or they have to go through a third-party service provider? There's no requirement to do this or that. Both options, we have yet to find the final requirement for that. However, we foresee that both options can be done. One question is saying, must I have online database or can I use offline database? Of course, you're free to use an offline database. You don't need to have an online database. However, in the integration phase, since you're going to share the invoice, you have to have a connectivity and share the invoices over the internet. If you have more questions. We have one question asking about the Gazet or Zacchaeus APIs for integration. They are not yet ready to be shared. As you said, we're working on that, and Shar will be sharing as soon as possible so you can test your environment. I see a lot of questions related to the data fields and the format. I urge you to check the technical documentation, specifically the data dictionary one. This will give you a lot of input and know-how about how to implement and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable and as a data field. So we have a question here related to the QR code. It says, does QR code stores information or stores link for the invoice? It stores the information, the actual information. One question here saying in the technical document, it says the buyer ID is needed on the e-invoice QR code. For example, the national ID of the buyer. Does that mean the retailers need to collect the ID of the buyer for the e-invoice? Now we're talking about retailers. Most likely you're talking about B2C. And in B2C, I don't think we're requiring to have the buyer information in the invoice itself. So if you go check again the data dictionary, you will find the mandatory field and when they are mandatory. So for example, if it is a simplified invoice or targeted toward the B2C, then most likely you will find the buyer information is not mandatory. We have another question here asking about the tamper protection, if there is any standard for that. I urge you to check the security feature implementation standard. You will find more information in that. And it's not sufficient or you still have questions, please feel free to shoot away. So we have another question is, do the companies have to purchase cash register or invoice register for issuance of invoices, which is able to generate QR code? So basically you have to check with your service provider if the system is upgradable enough and can embed the invoicing requirement into that, then you don't need to maybe purchase another machine. You can use your machine and be upgraded. And this is where we urge our partners and success, the solution providers, is to have as minimal as possible impact on the current customer base. We want this to be as smooth as possible. So if you can upgrade the current systems or release online patches or whatever to ease the transition, this will help us a lot in making a successful project, inshallah. So we have another question related to the simplified invoice. So for simplified invoice, if there is a company having multiple shops, what about the serial for the invoice? Should it be one for all or shop based? So basically we're assuming that different locations will have separate invoice generation solution units. So and each solution unit will have a different invoice sequence. So one of the questions is related to the integration, saying that after clearance from Zatkan, the integration phase, will it return the XML invoice with the crypto stamp included or with the crypto stamp only? So all the integration related specification will be released shortly, inshallah. Once the integration is up and running from our side, we will find all the details regarding the requests and responses for all the integration points. Another question related to the integration. We're talking about the interface parameters. Again, we are not yet ready to share the integration details. I would urge you to focus on the generation phase, since the integration is a bit long way ahead. So once we release the integration specification, you can go ahead and dig into the details of that. So another question is saying that can e-invoice be generated through a third-party tool and not the ERP solution? Of course, yes, it can. We see a lot of questions related to the registration and putting their solutions as an approved provider. We have yet to disclose any information regarding this. Please stay tuned. So we have a question, a bit technical question related to the hash. So part of the specification, we're saying that the invoice, one of the fields is to embed the previous invoice hash code in the invoice itself. So having the hash code of the previous invoice and the current invoice will ensure sequence. So if you're missing a hash in between, we can detect that there is a missing invoice in between. So that's why we're saying that you need to have the hash of the previous invoice and your current invoice. Again, a lot of questions related to the testing of the integration phase. Yes, we'll try to give as much time as possible for the testing phase. We understand that this is not something small or straightforward. We understand that there might be some issues with the service providers and our side as well. So we'll try to have ample time of testing before the integration phase, inshallah. Another question related to phase one regarding the standard invoice. They say that in phase one, standard invoice is created and stored. Is it mandatory to send it to the customer? In the digital format, no, you don't need in generation phase. One of the questions related to the logistics, saying that software provider has to be within Saudi or even outside of Saudi can support. Of course, outside of Saudi can be supported. However, the implementation itself or the deployment has to be within Saudi Arabia as per regulation. Just as a side note, I know that the number of questions is a lot and we have to filter through them. If we don't answer your question directly, inshallah, we'll be able to cover it in the next session. So one question is asking about the integration, how to look like. Will it be through APIs? Yes, it will be through APIs, but we're not ready to share the details of the APIs. So we have some questions related to the types of invoices that is within scope. Any VAT invoices, it has to be within the scope, whether it's a regular invoice, debit note, credit note, everything has to be within the scope. We're also receiving a lot of questions regarding storing the data outside of Saudi Arabia. As per the current regulation, even without the VAT, such thing shouldn't be, since it is Saudi data, cannot be hosted outside. Another important question is regarding the integration phase. If there is any connectivity failure, we're trying to embed some fail-tolerant approaches when it comes to the integration. We'll be announcing that once we have the integration details up and running. Inshallah, you will receive that. So yes, we expect that will be some connectivity issue or some technical issues when it comes to integration. So we have some of the workarounds or failovers when it comes to that. Again, some questions regarding storing the data in which format. In the generation phase, we're not requiring any format. However, in the integration, the format is specified, and you have to store it and share it in the same format, meaning XML or PDF/A with embedded XML. Again, we're receiving a lot of questions. It's very hard to filter through them. However, rest assured that we're going to cover as much as possible. If it's not within this session, the next session, or we can circulate it across. Again, the storage question is being popped up again, whether it has to be in an offline or online database. Again, the choice is yours. However, in the integration phase, since you're going to send the invoice to Zacchaeus, then there has to be some sort of connectivity. However, you can still store it locally as long as you'll be able to retrieve it digitally as well. Another question regarding phase one in generation, if the format of PDF is acceptable or not. Since it is a digital, you're not, I mean, it's generated by a system, you're not manually entering the fields or the values in the PDF itself, then it is fine. So as long as there is manual intervention in the file itself, then it's not fine. It has to be system generated, not manual. Again, I would just like to remind everyone, if you haven't registered in our website, please do so. The information is very valuable. We're receiving a lot of questions regarding the data fields themselves. I would urge you to go again through the data dictionary itself. And if you still have any doubts about the fields or the business rules behind these fields, please let us know if this is not clear so we can clear it up. Just a quick reminder, yes, the session will be held in Arabic in 2 days إن شاء الله. للإخوان المهتمين بالورشة بالعربي إن شاء الله يوم الخميس راح تعقد ورشة أخرى على نفس الموضوع باللغة العربية. Again, multiple questions regarding the connectivity question. We will be releasing the details of such failover plan once we are ready to publish it. But rest assured that we are working on that. I will be sharing the contact details for the team if you have any queries, so you can send it to that contact. We have a question regarding the APIs again. Yes, we will be sharing the APIs once they are ready. It will be very detailed. You'll have integration guide. You'll have sample requests and responses. Everything shall be clear for you, but we are not yet ready to share those. For the Arabic session, inshallah, we announce the timelines today, inshallah, maximum by tomorrow. So we have a question regarding the simplified format in phase 1, which is the generation phase, whether they have to be shared with a consumer or customer. So there is which format it has to be shared. So there's no specific format, and you can share it however you want, as long as it is. You can still share it in paper format as long as you're storing it digitally, as we said. The sandbox question is popping up again. Yes, we will have, inshallah, sandbox to make it easy for you to test your solutions. We understand that each client has different environments, so deployment will not be streamlined as much as we'd like. So that's why we'll have a sandbox to test your solutions and deployment before you deploy it into your taxpayer environment or customer environment from your point of view. We have a question regarding the verification of complying in phase 1. If you go back to the requirement in phase 1, you can see that most of the requirements are already there and within VAT regulation. However, the main two differences is that you have to print a QR code as per the specification that we have published, plus it has to be in an electronic format or digital format. It cannot be something manual. Even if you're printing it on a paper base, there has to be a digital copy of that invoice. So these are the two main. Of course, this is for the simplified. For the standard, there's even no QR code. It will be optional. It's not mandatory. بالنسبة للجلسة العربية نعم راح تحتاج تسجيل مثل الجلسة هذه. الشباب إن شاء الله راح يشاركوا الرابط قريبا. We have a question regarding the PDF format. I believe if you go through the technical specification, you'll find more details, but it seems that there is some misconception here, is that the PDF printout will be in A4 or A3. We're not talking about the printout. We're talking about the digital format of the file itself. So let me go back just to the technical requirements. So here when we say PDF A3, A3 is not the sizing of the paper itself. No, we're talking about the format. Please refer to the technical documentation. I believe it will have more info regarding that. So we have a question here regarding the tags of the XML. Yes, you have to follow the data dictionary. Another question is regarding the invoices, whether they should be generated in real time or not. I'm not sure I understand the question, but of course, whenever the invoice is generated, it has to be generated in real time. We have some questions regarding the data dictionary or the documentation, general technical documentation, whether they are final or not. It's pretty advanced, and I would say if there is any tweak, it will be very minor. And if there is any update, definitely we will be announcing that publicly. بالنسبة لمنصات الإعلان عن الورش تكون عادة في التواصل الاجتماعي أو في موقع الهيئة راح تلاقي الروابط هذه. So one of the questions is saying regarding uploading the invoices to Zatka server, whether it has to be immediately or not. I'm assuming that this is probably related to the B2C or the simplified invoices. If it is yes, then it has to be near real time. So understand that due to connectivity and the load, it might not be instant, but it has to be near instant. Someone is asking about the technical documentation, where they can find it. Please visit zatka.gov.sa. You'll find the tab for the e-invoicing. You'll find all the information that you need in that. We have yet to announce the accreditation process or where to apply, so please stay tuned for that. We will be sharing it once if we go with such approach. But I think we're nearing the end of the discussion. Again, thank you very much for attending today. Today is the first session. It's not going to be final. We will have these sessions very frequent. We will compile all the questions that you have and try to answer them to the best that we can. Again, thank you very much for that. We're looking forward to your cooperation in this national project. The success of this project relies heavily on your cooperation as well. You are our ambassadors in this project. So if you have any questions or anything, the guys will link the contact information. Please go ahead and contact us. Again, thank you very much for attending.